So let's get on to the big hitters. Obviously, when we look at Germany have some amazing armoured cars, and probably have the biggest argument for armoured cars to be in War Thunder. Either the Germans or the British. The Russians definitely have a case too. So, where do we start? We start off with the Sd.Kfz 234 Puma. Now, the Puma is an amazing vehicle, and was an amazing vehicle in the war. Only about 500 were built, which has always been surprising to me. But one of the things that the Germans did compared to a lot of other nations, apart from the British, is that they put different guns on their tanks. So they would start off with the Sd.Kfz 234/1, which had the Kwk-30L55 autocannon on it, so very similar to the Panzer IIc one, the 20mm, so that could easily be tier 1. And then they gradually moved up, so we have the /2, which had the 20mm on it also, the /3, which pushed it to the 75mm K51 L24 standard howitzer. How fun would that be? The /4 had the 75mm that you see on, what would you see it on? Basically you'd see it on the Panzer IV, so kind of like an anti-tank 75, a long-barreled one instead of a howitzer variant. There was also a 50mm Puma, which is probably the one that most people know about, either that or the 20mm one. So the thing is, there are many variants of the Puma, and they are all wonderful. It is an 8-wheeled vehicle, supposedly all-terrain, and it could go 80 kilometers an hour on road, 60 off the road, and 10.5 tons max. Definitely a crazy machine. And the thing is, with the Puma, you could have a whole tree for it. You could start off with the 20mm variant, move up to the short-barreled 75, put in the 50mm somewhere, then move on to the long-barreled 75, and then the long-barreled 50mm with a turret on it. And that would basically be a really good line for Germany. It could be a whole line just by itself, and I believe the Puma is one of the best arguments for having armoured cars in the game, because it could stand up to a lot of vehicles that it would have to face. It wouldn't have the armour, but it would definitely have the firepower and the manoeuvrability, which I think is much more useful in War Thunder than just armour. Moving on, we have the Sd.Kfz 251 Hanomag. Now, you will know this, the 251, because the 251 is the general half-track, the personnel carrier that you see in all the movies when it comes to World War II, and a lot of World War II footage. So it's basically the half-track, which has two wheels at the front, the tracks, and then the quite large area on the back where people sit, generally mounted by two MG42s or MG34s. Now, we already kind of have a variant of this in game when it comes to the 88mm, which we have in game, which still is a bit low for me when it comes to its BR. But there are other variants which I think could definitely fit in the game, which would be a hell of a lot of fun. So if I can just find them here. There was one which was mounted with a mortar. Now, mortars are interesting. I will do a separate video at some point looking into howitzers, artillery machines like the Priest and the Bishop, and mortars in general. But I think it would be a nice add-on to the game. And the Sd.Kfz 251/2, the Granatwerfer, it had an 81mm mortar in it. So that could be a lot of fun. Especially, I think it would change up the game quite a lot, depending on its BR. You could basically have artillery constantly, maybe a bit more accurate, and it would give you something to do to push onto a position instead of just try and peek out and see what's going on. But there are some other variants which are much more interesting. The /4 variant, it could tow basically the 75mm, 50mm, and the light field howitzers, the 105mm. That's another interesting thing that we can talk about in the game, where basically you could have a half track which pulls a gun, and then you have to stop the half track, and then maybe after 10 seconds it sets up the gun, and then you have to mount the gun. And you know, that could be something to talk about. Well, once again, that's for another video. There was a Flammpanzerwagen model of this half track. It was the /16. That could be interesting. I'm not really sure about it. I'm more bothered about if we can have some decent anti-tank variants. The one which always stands out is the Schützenpanzerwagen, which is the one which was mounted with the 37mm pack gun. I believe that could definitely be in game. It would fit very well in Tier 1 or even Tier 2, depending on the penetration of the 37. The one which definitely should be in game though is the 75mm Pack 40, which is the Sd.Kfz 251/22. This is the half track, which would be a great anti-tank destroyer, and would be very similar to the 88 that we have in game, apart from it wouldn't be mounted on the back, so it wouldn't have full control of where it could look. It could only really look forward, but I think it could work extremely well in the game, and that would be the variant I would push for if we could only have one type of the 251 in game. You could mount it with all different types of howitzers and everything like that. The /9 version had a howitzer on it, so did the Ausf D and the Ausf C had different variants of the howitzer. So yeah, I think it could be done. I really do think it could be done with this machine. Moving on, we have something in the middle. The Sd.Kfz 231 8-rad. Now there was 1,200 of these built. There was more of these built than the Puma, double more. And this is another great example of a machine which could, in effect, have a very good impact on Tier 1 or Reserve. Probably Tier 1. Unfortunately, it doesn't share the same love as the Puma. The Puma changed with variants, it changed its guns. With the 8-rad, basically it kept the 20mm all the way through, but at 85 kilometers an hour on road and 60 off, this thing's gonna chuck about the place. It's 8.3 tons of wonderful German steel, and it's gonna bash people. With its 20mm, we know how deadly they can be in game already, and with that speed, maybe not great maneuverability with its 8 wheels, but you know, it's another thing to change the game up, make it a bit quicker, see what happens at these lower levels where a lot of these armoured cars would fit great. Also, there's the 231, which was the 6-rad, basically a 6-wheeled variant. I think that could work pretty well. And just a fourth one for Germany, just because the Germans had so many of these armoured cars which were mounted with pretty decent guns. We have the Sd.Kfz 221/222/223. So depending on which variant you're talking about, the 222 I believe was mounted with the 20mm. That would be the one I would go for in game. The 221 had the MG34 on it, I believe, and then basically the 222s had the 20mm, and then the 223 was much more designed as kind of like a command vehicle. So the 222 would be the one you would push for. It's very similar to one of the premium vehicles that we have in game, which was given out, I believe, to get into the German-Russian closed beta, like the initial ground forces beta. So I think it could definitely be in game. It's another one of those very iconic vehicles that you see in a lot of games and a lot of movies, so it would make sense if it was in game as well. 4-wheeled compared to a lot of the 6 and 8-wheeled stuff, so maneuverability will be quite fun in it. 80 kilometers an hour on the road. You're going to be zipping in this thing, but it does take a big hit off-road at 40 kilometers an hour. You could even put in the MG34 variant or the MG42 variant. I still think it would do well at reserve with its speed and everything, but it may have a few issues, but a lot of these tanks would anyway. Moving on to the British. Now the British have some interesting little armoured cars. We start off with the Guy armoured car, an absolute midget of a thing. it's very, very tiny, with its 4 wheels. Very shunted. It basically looks like somebody who's had stunted growth. At 64 kilometers an hour, very nippy, with a wonderful Meadows 4 ELA 4-cylinder petrol with 55 horsepower respectively, 5.2 tons, so pretty heavy. And it also, the Mark 1A, which is the version which I would push to have in the game, it had a 15mm and an 18mm machine gun. So this machine could definitely do some damage at lower tiers. The Mark 1, I believe, only had a 7.7 on it, just because a lot of vehicles around that time for the British, especially when it came to his light tanks, no, sorry, it had 2 8mm, so 2 303s on it, so basically the same thing. But a lot of light tanks, such as the Vickers tanks and armoured cars, didn't have huge weaponry, but the 15mm, the Besser 15mm heavy machine gun, definitely could do damage at around reserve and tier 1, so I think it's a vehicle that has to be considered. Definitely not the main one when looking at the British, but 100 of them were made, so it's something to look at. We move on to the AEC armoured car. Now the AEC armoured car is quite a large armoured car, and it's one of those ones which in a way looks like an off-road buggy, which I think is really, really interesting. Also, it's very much like the Puma, where they tried a bunch of different guns on it, starting with, I believe, the 40mm moving up to the 57, and there were even variants with the 75 on it. Basically, the Mark 1 had the AEC 190 diesel engine. It had the Valentine Mark 1 turret with the 2-pounder, which is the 40mm, and it had a Besser 8mm machine gun, which is okay. The Mark II had a 195 diesel, so slightly larger than the Mark 1. It was 12.7 tons, heavier turret, and it had the 57mm, so basically they changed the turret to fit the gun, and then once again the Besser 8mm. The Mark III had the same engine as the Mark II. It had a 75mm main gun and a secondary armament which is equal to the 8mm Besser machine gun. There was also an AA variant which was tested with the Crusader AA turret for operations in Europe but never produced. That could be interesting, but we need more higher tier AA in my opinion. Like that tier 3 and 4 place for Britain really needs a good AA. But right now, looking at the AEC, you have a little truck which can go 65 kilometers an hour or 40 miles per hour respectively, at 12.7 tons, and can dish out firepower. That 75mm can be deadly. When we look at the British tanks, the 40mm with its high fire rate can also be very deadly. And what was the other gun that they tried? The 57 also is pretty good, even if it does basically next to no damage. But if you put this around that tier 2 area and tier 1, depending on the gun, it's gonna fit really, really well. It's gonna be very similar to a lot of the British tanks that are already there. And it just looks wonderful. It looks like a nice little doom buggy with a gun on it, and that, to me, is very interesting. It will get one-shot a lot since it only has 3 crew, but generally a lot of these vehicles are gonna get one-shot. Moving on to the bread and butter of the British line, the Daimler armoured car. Now we already have some Daimlers in game. The first 2 AA with the 50 cals and the 20s, they're Daimler chassis, so there is already an argument for the Daimler to be put into game. I was quite surprised when it wasn't added on at release or even considered. But the Mark 1 had a 40mm on it. The Mark 1 CS was a close support version with a 76mm on it, and then the Mark 2 had an improved turret, modified gun mount, better radiator, driver escape hatch incorporated into the roof. Isn't that kind of nice? The WP grenade container fitted to turret, and the smoke generator container modified. There was also a turretless regimental command version, and it was known as the SOD, the sawn-off Daimler. So the ones that we're going to be looking at is the Mark 1 and the Mark 1 CS, the one with the 40mm and the one with the 76. Can you imagine having a 76 on this thing? I think it would be really interesting. I'm a big advocate for having very small tanks with very large guns. I think it would be fun, like having a Tetrarch with a 95 on it. I think would be great. But the Daimler should definitely be in the game. It could go at 80 kilometers an hour on road, so probably about 60 off-road, and with the 40mm gun, once again, high fire rate, it's going to do a lot of damage, and you're going to be nipping in and out of a lot of places on the map. But once again, it looks like a Doom buggy. It looks like the type of armoured car you would want in the game. It's something different, and you already have a pre-existing chassis. All you have to do is build a turret for it, and Bob's your uncle. There you go. It's not as if all of these guns aren't in the game, all of the shells aren't in the game. This chassis is in the game. All you have to do is tweak a few numbers on it, and you make a turret, and that's all you have to do for this thing, and it could be in-game tomorrow. Simple as that. Moving on to the Americans, the last stop in our quest for looking at the armoured cars. We have, of course, the M8 Greyhound, another wonderful example of an armoured car which will hopefully make its way into War Thunder. This is a vehicle which was, well, it had six wheels, very similar to a lot of other stuff out there, and mounted with a 37mm. Now, this machine, when we look at other games such as Men of War, Company of Heroes, stuff like that, it's in a lot of games as kind of like that in-between vehicle before you get something like a Sherman or a heavier tank. But I think it could work really well in War Thunder. The 37mm at tier 1, or even breaching into low tier 2s, could do a hell of a lot of damage. And even though, well, actually, sorry, not even though, the speed of this thing, 90 kilometers an hour, 56 miles per hour, that's incredibly quick for something like this. Now, will it reach that speed in game? Probably not. But with a 37mm, you know it's going to pull its weight. It's going to struggle a little bit with its armor, but all of these vehicles are going to struggle for their armor. And the biggest case for this to be in game, just like some of the Russian vehicles, 8,523 of these bad boys built. There is no reason for this not to be in game, and hopefully it will be soon. Also, there is a case for the M20 utility car to be in game. It was basically a M8 Greyhound without the turrets with a mounted 50 cal, and that could be incredibly fun. Incredibly fun in the game, just because the 50 cal can pretty much penetrate everything at tier 1. So running around with that thing at let's say 60 kilometers an hour, just trying to gun down people, that could cause a bit of mayhem and be enjoyable. Another one is going back to the Russian design, the armored car M1. There's only 12 of these built, so this is a kind of maybe not for the Americans when we look at reserves. This was built in 1931. Yes, it's very, very old. It had a 50 HMG, the 12.7 M1921, and it had a 7.62 Browning 1920, mounted in a turret on the back, and it's very similar to the BA. I wouldn't be surprised, just like the BT series, if either the Americans came up with this designs and the Russians nicked it, or vice versa, because there is massive similarities between this and the BA. Also, 55 miles per hour, 89 kilometers an hour on road, very quick, and with that 50 or 0.5, sorry, the M1921, it could do decent damage in reserve. It's another tank that could fit our reserve billing. There's not much else to say that I haven't said about the BA. Now let's put in an interesting tank, which could be a premium tier 1. It is the Sutton Skunk. Now this was intended for the Republic of China in 1932, but I believe it was, let's just see. It was built by Frank One-Arm Sutton, Englishman and adventurer. That's very, very British. But I can't remember why this would be in the American line. Oh, there we go. The Sutton Skunk was essentially an armoured body placed on the Caterpillar semi-armoured 5-ton M1917 artillery tractor. In 1918, the American Army had huge numbers of the tractor, and by 1932 still had 600 in surplus. Trying to get rid of them, the vehicles were actually up for sale, and the US Army eventually lowered the price from $8,000, $140,000 in today's money, to $800, $14,000 in today's money. So that's why it's in the American line. It's kind of a weird looking thing. There's not much, there would be absolutely no use for in-game, and it is tracked as well. But I definitely think it could be kind of interesting just to have as a reserve premium. It could be one of those challenge tanks, it really could be, in the American line. Moving on to a much more makes sense thing, we have the M2 half-track. Now it's very hard to talk about the American Armed Forces in World War II and not talk about the M2 half-track. It's another one of the machines which was used as a personnel carrier, it was used for infantry support, and it was also used to mount a few more larger guns on it, such as the 37mm M3 MGMC. I believe the one that we have in game right now is the 75mm MGMC. I might be wrong about that. It may be the 37, but I believe it has the Sherman gun, so it would be the 75. So the variant of the M2, the 37, could definitely fit in the game. Just before the 75 variant, it is a half-track with 2 wheels and tracks on the back, very similar to the German one we looked at earlier. And if you want to, a reserve, you could put in one with just the 50 cal on the front, and then add in the one with the 37. You could even add in some with the 30s, the 30 cals, but you know, that would be kind of useless. Also, there is an argument to put in another mortar variant. The M4A1 81mm MMC mortar carrier version had a 50 cal and a mortar. That would be a hell of a lot of fun, and it'd be interesting if we ever see something like that in game. I would love to see something like that, but apart from that, 37mm would do me fine. We already have the 75mm, so you know, I think it's definitely possible to have something like the M2 in game. And as a wild card, an absolute wild card for the Americans, I would throw in as a premium the M38 Wolfhound. Now, if you don't know what the M38 Wolfhound is, it is a legendary weird vehicle. It is basically a Chaffee turret mounted on a Greyhound chassis, looks completely ridiculous, and it had the 37mm M6 on it. It also had a 50 cal and a 30 cal. I'm pretty sure it was never really made. Well, a prototype was made, but it was never put into production. But that could definitely be a good premium. It's basically a quick Chaffee, which sometimes I feel like the Chaffee in game is quite slow, so it would be nice to have something with a bit of nip. But that is a bit of a wild card, and we already have 3 vehicles for the Americans. So there's the armoured cars I would put into the game. I think there can be decent arguments made for all of them, and I can't really think of a counter argument to not have these armoured cars in game, since we already have models. When we look at aircraft, when we look at AI vehicles, we have the model of the Greyhound in game. So hopefully we do get an update with all of these armoured cars or similar variants. I think it would be a wonderful thing. But anyway, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you next time.